can be more difficult than, well, is sort of sometimes the most difficult place to get these passed. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Will Thomas. I'm the executive director of Open New York. Woohoo! Yeah, we're the local sort of pro-housing group for the New York metropolitan area. But do we want to just do a round robin of everyone introducing themselves?
Sure. Thanks, Will. I'm Meg Fencil. I'm the Director of Engagement and Impact at Sustain Charlotte in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're a nonprofit organization that advocates for sustainable land use and transportation choices, and more recently working on housing reform.
Sam Diaz, he, him, his, Executive Director at 1000 Friends of Oregon. Morning.
Morning, everybody. Dov Kadin. I work at the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. We're the metropolitan planning organization for the Sacramento region. And then outside of work, I also am co-chair of our local YIMBY chapter, House Sacramento.
So thank you all for joining us. I think we want to start off with just the victories and explaining, what precisely we've done. So Dov, would you want to start off with, what you've achieved?
Sure. Yeah. So maybe I'll just give a little bit of context around Sacramento. We're in kind of an interesting, I think, position as a city right now. Historically, I think Sacramento has been the affordable alternative to coastal California, in particular the Bay Area. Reputation of being a little bit sleepy, kind of a government town. Then in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a pretty substantial level of growth driven in part from folks, in the Bay Area, maybe cashing out some of their equity, moving east for a little bit more elbow room. Certainly it's been accelerated during COVID, but there's also, of course, a lot of economic displacement happening from folks on the lower end of the spectrum moving to Sacramento. We're the fastest growing large city in California, and I think we actually have the highest rate of price and rent growth as well. I think the last 5 years we've seen about 10% year-over-year rent growth, pretty substantial, and actually I think some of the highest in the country, depending on the year. It's kind of wild to say, but I think now the 2-bedroom rent in Sacramento is more expensive than Portland, which is wild to me, having been in the city the last few days and enjoyed how cool Portland is. At the same time, I think we've had a history of not always really having that demand. I think, despite that big influx, there's been a little bit of a struggle to get, infill multifamily products to actually pencil. We, despite that sort of increase in price, we're still significantly cheaper than the Bay Area. It's all relative, and but we do have similar construction costs, so we do kind of struggle with that market feasibility component. So again, this weird combination of rapidly increasing prices, this market feasibility issue, and then I think just a recognition and a politics around not wanting to become the Bay Area. It's very visible to us that is a policy failure, and so we're trying to do whatever we can to avoid that. So in terms of just the types of policy reforms that we've done, I think laying the groundwork for some of the zoning victories that we've seen or are in process of in the last couple of years. We did eliminate parking requirements downtown and around light rail stations. I think within a half mile of our light rail system, we have 0 parking requirements now. One of the bigger victories we had recently was the adoption of a ministerial approval process. So basically all infill multifamily products are now subject to a buy right approval process. That's particularly significant in California because it means they're not subject to the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which is often the vehicle by which we see projects litigated and opposed. It also is kind of a big deal for House Sacramento because I think, in the past and sort of, I guess the origins of the YIMBY movement, right, we're going to your local city council meeting and supporting an individual project. And we can actually now focus more of our resources and time and energy on policy reform, zoning reform, as opposed to kind of having to fight every individual battle at the project level. And then I think we've been somewhat ahead of the state on ADU policy. We have a very permissive ADU policy. For a while now, we've allowed 2 ADUs and a junior ADU on every parcel, no parking requirements, no owner occupancy requirements. So it's a very good ADU code as well. So I think the The reason why I was asked to speak here today is because we're in the process of updating our general plan, which is like our comprehensive plan, depending on where you come from, call it differently. But 20-year constitution for growth, right? Big opportunity for big structural changes. And they're proposing quite a bit as a part of this update. I think the main one is we're looking at doing away with density-based restrictions and allowing at least a fourplex or a bungalow court on every parcel across the city by right. And so they're looking at a floor area ratio of 1.0, which is quite permissive right now in those areas. The city is about 70% single family for the residential areas, so this is a pretty substantial blanket upzoning of the whole city. They're also proposing, as a part of the general plan update, ratcheting up allowed densities on commercial corridors, where transit frequencies are high and where SACOG has sort of designated these areas as really key to meeting our climate goals and requiring some revitalization. They're also looking at fully repealing or eliminating parking minimums citywide. It's sort of already there, but not quite, especially in these kind of more suburban corridors, so that would be a big step. They're also talking about exploring parking maximums. I'm a little bit skeptical about whether or not they'll be able to actually move forward with that politically, but that's currently on the table. And then just some more YIMBY adjacent policies that they're looking at around banning gas in new buildings, doing road diets basically everywhere. They're looking at a reduction in lane miles across the city, which is significant for our region. Equity framework for prioritizing all future transportation investments. So it's a huge kind of omnibus of policy change. I will say I was getting a little bit nervous when I saw a lot of some of the national publications, at least in the niche, YIMBY and planning world, saying Sacramento eliminated single-family zoning. Not quite yet. Basically what happened is the city council unanimously adopted a series of key strategies to explore in the general plan, which included those things that I just mentioned. This was not an adoption of the zoning update. So that battle is still underway. Public review draft coming soon, and then hopefully adopting the general plan itself this year. Of course, then you're going to hear from Meg about sort of the subsequent process of actually updating the zoning code. That is, would be after the general plan for us. So definitely more to come, but I think it's safe to say if they're able to actually follow through with what they have, started in this process, it'd be, I think, one of the most permissive zoning codes in the country and one of the bigger zoning reform wins that I've seen, at least.
We would love to hear that. But Sam, would you want to give us an update on the context in Portland?
Sure, yeah. Okay, before I begin, I would love kind of a show of hands. Who's from Oregon? Just in terms of, okay, so I may explain a little bit more. So for Oregon folks, feel free to chime in. There's a lot of history, a lot of context here. West Coast, just generally. Okay, all right, East, okay, awesome. Okay, Mountain Range. Okay, welcome. I'm so glad you made it. And then East Coast. Okay, well, great. Okay, well, it's good. Okay, sorry. Good. Well, that's very helpful for me as I zoom in, zoom out, and also rewind and fast forward a little bit for you to explain kind of the local wins. 1,000 Friends was founded as a statewide watchdog group a year after Governor Tom McCall and a number of legislative leadership came together under a big tent to create the statewide land use planning program. Environmentalists, farmers, ranchers, housing advocates, the walkable, bikeable vision that a lot of that you experience actually today for the conference all came together and said, at the time, we're looking at other states and other cities and not agreeing with how decisions were being made about growth. There was a lot of subdivision development, a lot of freeway expansion, right? You think of the federal stimulus dollars that were happening at the time in the 60s and 70s, and Oregonians came together and said, not for us. We have amazing soils here, world-class soils. We have amazing farms, forests, scenic vistas, and we're going to protect it. And that is a statewide priority, and so they created a statewide planning program because of that. So that is the shoulders, all of the founders, right? Tom McCall, Henry Richmond, Hector McPherson, Nancy Fadley. Those are the shoulders that 1,000 Friends stands on, and why we're even able to have this conversation about our local wins. So I always like to do justice as much as I can to the guardians of Senate Bill 100 and our land use planning program. Fast forward a little bit to the Portland metro area, became a very fast-growing metro area in 2010, especially. We saw an uptick, a lot of folks moving here, and as a result, a lot of displacement. 1,000 Friends, while we work at the statewide level, we do believe in cities and towns kind of being the keepers of their vision and their destiny, and making sure that voices of community members are lifted up. And so we use them, I'd say, kind of like laboratories, right? Figure out what works for zoning reform, for funding and financing, and be a technical assistant provider to community members. And so the organization identified 2 priorities, and I want to start, if I use passive language, challenge me and say, Sam, who exactly was that, right? Government always says this thing happened, and we discount who, like the machine that actually made it happen. So challenge me on that if I use passive language. I am a recovering bureaucrat, so I have that in me. We had several board members, Nolan Leinhart, Dr. Lisa Bates, Anya Lehalova, who came together and said, lean into the people who want to encourage smart growth, who want to encourage equitable growth. Bring them in, bring them closer. What are their ideas? And so if you give a lot of oxygen that way, then you start developing policy solutions, you start lining up testimony, you start building the coalition to get you the policy wins that's really going to unlock housing reform. And so we had 2 coalitions, 1,000 Friends co-founded 2 coalitions, the Anti-Displacement PDX Coalition, really focused on the city's comprehensive plan, and Portland for Everyone. And that was really focused on residential infill project, so duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. I'm seeing head nods. That I think City of Portland has been in the paper for. Sacramento, you'll get there on the actual zoning, and so it finally is in the permit counter, right? If you're a developer, if you're a homeowner, you can go to our development services and apply to build a duplex. So just want to let you know the signal's there and the paperwork's there. So the Anti-Displacement Coalition, and I'll start there. Actually, was focused on the rapid displacement of a lot of renters. Disproportionate amount of Black and brown folks. And a lot of the planners, this is one of my pet peeves, I'm kind of like just airing it out right now, this is like part therapy for me, is that planners will look at a snapshot and then 10 years later there's another snapshot, at least here, and they'll say, oh, there's racial integration happening in Portland. And what actually was happening was a lot of Black and brown folks were being pushed out and priced out of Portland. From a planning perspective, if you look at the snapshot, you're saying, oh, great, now we have more people, right? We've achieved racial integration, right? Because more people who are white are coming into the city. And that and our suburban areas like Vancouver, Washington, Gresham, we're actually starting to, Hillsborough, Beaverton, we're starting to see more Black and brown folks move out. And so the ground truthing, the storytelling was really important for Anti-Displacement PDX to lift up, to make sure that we were centering those who were being priced out and pushed out, and start really looking at what the zoning rules are that were creating that change and creating that harm. So the win was 15 policies in the comprehensive plan, and requires our city bureaus to do an anti-displacement risk analysis when they have major infrastructure projects, when they have policy reforms. And then that leads me to Portland for Everyone's work, which is the residential infill project, the Better Housing by Design, which really focuses on multi-dwelling apartment units, and some funding, actually, for the anti-displacement efforts. So, and those wins were only made possible, right, because the Portland for Everyone Coalition was able to reach out, was able to call and build relationships with the Anti-Displacement PDX Coalition and YIMBY here in Portland, and have kind of a mega coalition meeting. And I'll talk more about that in like the questions. But the wins of that are getting the residential infill project through our city council, Better Housing by Design passed, and $160,000 for anti-displacement funding to support the organizing, the storytelling, the analysis, to make sure that we can redress and course correct the anti-displacement that is happening in our region.
Thanks, Sam. Well, taking us across the country to Charlotte, North Carolina, we had a victory last June in which our city council passed our comprehensive plan 6-5. So while it wasn't as decisive as we would have liked, it's a very important step to getting us to the actual zoning regulations that city council will vote on this summer, hopefully, to actually give this thing teeth. So about 75% of the residential land in Charlotte is currently zoned for single-family homes. Obviously, there's a massive, racial injustice history to that. We are also were identified in 2014 in the Equality of Opportunity Study as the lowest economic mobility of the 50 largest U.S. cities. So there's a very strong equity framework that was built into the creation of the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. We had a very visionary planning director who really made a lot of change happen. And unfortunately, fortunately for Greensboro, unfortunately for Charlotte, he's now the city manager there, but he really, really was a wonderful ally in this work. So the comprehensive plan, the part of it that we are most excited about, and I want to point out, it's not just a land use plan, it also is a mobility plan. There's a strategic mobility plan, we hope will be very closely modeled on Austin's, that will be a supporting document to the Unified Development Ordinance. So it does go beyond land use to really think about how people are moving through the city. And the Unified Development Ordinance is going to really be the regulation. So it will align the city's land use regulations with the vision of the comprehensive plan and also other adopted city policies. So we have a lot of outdated and contradictory policies right now. There's a tree canopy ordinance, stormwater ordinance, we have transportation and street design guidelines. And Charlotte has not had a comprehensive plan since the 1970s, and obviously a lot of change has happened since that time. So the part of the comprehensive plan that I think is most pertinent to this group is policy 2.1, which would legalize duplexes and triplexes by right on all single-family lots. Possible loophole in there is that if there is a restrictive covenant or an HOA that does not allow the building of anything other than single-family homes, it possibly would not apply there. And quadplexes would be allowed fronting on arterials, major roads. So we see this as a fantastic opportunity to bring more housing density to Charlotte. And this is especially critical in North Carolina because we are strongly a Dillon's Law state, and the state does not allow inclusionary zoning. So the city of Charlotte has very few tools to require developers to build any affordable or workforce housing. If the city or the county sells land to a developer, they can require that affordable or workforce housing be built. There's a density bonus, which has not been very attractive to developers. And one of the really, really critical reasons that this Unified Development Ordinance is so important is that it will replace the current process of rezoning. So many residents are still somewhat skeptical about the UDO. They want to make sure it really has the right policies in place, the right regulations in place to enforce the policies of the comprehensive plan. Because right now the rezoning process is a way that residents can ask developers to build workforce and affordable housing if they want to build something other than what the by right zoning designation would allow. So as an example, in my neighborhood, a developer submitted a rezoning petition wanting to build 17 units per acre, which is great. We're excited about density. The by right would have allowed them to build 12 units per acre. So we were able to literally sit down with them at a brewery and have a conversation and say that we would support the rezoning petition if it included about 10% workforce housing. So the Unified Development Ordinance is meant to level the playing field. Charlotte is trying to become a plan-making city instead of a deal-making city. And one of the things that we're watching very closely is that once the Unified Development Ordinance is passed, that it will actually be implemented fairly and consistently. Just a few months ago, we saw a Chick-fil-A rezoning in a TOD area pass through City Council with the 2 or 3 drive-through lanes. Should never have happened. So not only do we need the right regulations, but we really need to make sure that our coalition is strongly monitoring the implementation of that and making sure that it is truly an ordinance that has teeth.
Thank you, Meg. And then just to give some context about how it is in New York, I think New York has this reputation of being, a very, building city. It's the biggest city in the country. There's skyscrapers all over the place in Manhattan. How could there be a housing shortage? But the problem is that most of the housing that New York built was built a very long time ago. The city does not build much housing today. There is an immense housing shortage. Manhattan built less housing in 2020 than Jersey City. Permitted less housing than Jersey City just across the Hudson in 2020. We frequently build less housing per capita than San Francisco. In terms of our suburbs are probably the worst, have the worst construction in the country per capita when you compare them to the suburbs of the Bay Area, to Boston, certainly to D.C., but even, again, across the river to New Jersey. So in New York, the result of that has been that, we frequently trade off with San Francisco for, most expensive city in the country. And so that has led to a need for a pro-housing movement, which is where we've come. We actually came out of the YIMBY conference in Boulder, Colorado. I was actually not there present for it, but a number of New Yorkers were there, and it was quickly determined that we needed to have a movement of our own. So we have been much more in sort of the individual supporting projects, trenches, but we have, at least over the course of 2018, 2019, it became clear that we had to go bigger. We could not, advocate for individual projects, and fix the housing shortage that way. We decided to push for neighborhood rezonings, or at least support, neighborhood rezonings that would add significant amount of housing. Another issue in New York, which I think is frequently seen throughout the country as well, is there's sort of this unwritten rule of not rezoning wealthy neighborhoods. The previous mayor, Michael Bloomberg, had upzoned almost only industrial and low-income areas for growth. He frequently downzoned wealthy white neighborhoods in New York City. When we moved on to de Blasio, who's the progressive, Brooklyn alternative to follow him, de Blasio moved to, he did stop downzoning, for the most part, wealthy white neighborhoods. But he continued the practice of only rezoning low-income and industrial neighborhoods for growth. So that created an opportunity for us, at least, to say we have to push for rezonings in high-opportunity neighborhoods. And a opportunity presented itself with a rezoning in Soho and NoHo, which you may have heard is like a very Tony ritzy shopping district in the heart of Manhattan. We were able to push for a rezoning there that would allow for 3,200 homes, mixed income. 800 of those are going to be income restricted. And it took us 3 years of a campaign to do, but we were able to successfully pass that rezoning. So that's mostly what I'm here to talk about today. So we were thinking of explaining how we built the coalitions and strategies to get these passed. So Dev, would you like to
Sure.
start us off
yeah,
again?
Yeah, I think, in terms of the coalition in Sacramento, it's probably relatively similar, but just there's some kind of interesting differences, I guess. I think, the first kind of rung of the coalition is mostly in the advocacy space. And I think for us, it was really critical to get some of the sort of more traditional housing equity voices to be a part of the conversation. These are folks that in Sacramento hold a lot of cachet, I think, with the more sort of progressive wing of the city council. And I think the reason it's important, I think, is because these are organizations that historically have exclusively been sort of advocating for subsidized, deed-restricted affordable housing. And so this notion of, fourplexes in single-family neighborhoods was not something that, was directly related to their, I think, original mission, but having them on board and kind of this recognition that these are policies that will sort of benefit everybody and benefit their cause, I think was really key politically. Of course, the local YIMBY group has been tremendously impactful, I think, bringing a younger voice, I think, to the conversation, a more diverse, less white voice. I think, and then just another interesting mix of other allies. We have, interestingly, a really active architecture, the AIA chapter has been really involved, and they've kind of mocked up what these sort of products can actually look like, and I think that's really important to kind of dispel this myth that these are going to be skyscrapers in your rich neighborhood. It's really in scale. Of course, the business community, Metro Chamber, has been very involved. I think going back to the politics of Sacramento and not always having that demand, I think there's kind of a recognition that this lens of economic prosperity and wanting to make sure that we're not losing that demand and sort of losing our service workers was important. Building Industry Association, environmental groups are on board, although, to be, much, I guess, to my dismay as someone who comes to the housing movement from the environmental lens, really have not had a tremendous impact, at least on our politics, I would say, so far. So that's kind of the advocacy rung. I think just the second rung is around, I guess, governmental and quasi-governmental agencies and organizations that have really kind of provided, more support than and have been more helpful than I would have expected. Definitely SACOG for sure has been a strong supporter. The Air Quality Management District, we're in a non-attainment zone. They've been really actually quite impactful. Sacramento Regional Transit, recognizing that their ridership in part depends on having proximate folks near their light rail and bus corridors. They've really been outspoken. And just maybe expanding a little bit on SACOG, I mean, I think, and maybe city planning staff is just being nice to me, but I think they've said that the institutional support of having a third party in the room and to also a certain extent the state pushing for these things really makes a difference. And we've put out a couple policy toolkits that kind of got ahead of the city and kind of made the policy case for why zoning reform makes sense. We've talked explicitly about the very real ways that our current land use policies reinforce and exacerbate some of the racial inequality that we have in our region. So I think that kind of gave them a little bit more, it emboldened their sort of tone about how they talk about those issues. And we've provided a lot of funding for them to actually make these changes. These are expensive changes to make, and it's a very long, arduous process to get through. And the environmental is expensive, and it's just a big lift. And so, the extent to which they can get funding from organizations that actually really benefit from these changes and actually have some purse strings is a big deal. And then just the last thing I would say is, I think we have an unusually good and proactive local planning staff, and have actually, taken the tact of proposing these things, not really waiting and being reactive to what, council says that they want. I think part of that is they know that if they can, we have a very pro-housing council and a very pro-housing mayor right now, who literally kind of wrote some of the state legislation that has been, promoting smart growth policy and climate policy in California. So the staff knows if they go out on a limb, right, they're not going to get fired. I think that's probably the biggest thing, but it's huge, right? And I think sometimes it gets a little bit overlooked to me in the YIMBY movement, and maybe I'm just being defensive as a planner myself, but how often do you see stuff on Twitter about, the planners are the problem and we just need to, circumvent the planners, right? Go to the state level. And, that might be true for state reform, but I guess, if you're doing local reform, you need good planners who actually believe this stuff, that are inside the machine, that can get the ball moving. They have access to city council members in a way that, advocacy organizations don't. So I think it's a really critical coalition piece that is sometimes overlooked.
Yeah. So I'll focus on Portland for Everyone. Once our board approved, and again, there were a number of board meetings because we have a natural tension of how much staff time and resources do we allocate to different parts of the state or different initiatives, right? If we hire an organizer that's going to work on housing reform in Portland, that's going to take away from staff attorney time working on farm and forest land protection. And the majority of our revenue does come from individual contributions. That's why we have flexibility. That's why we can litigate when we need to. And so that does represent kind of the strength and the I guess the nimble nature of our work. But that also requires us to have really strong ability to have types of resource and budget conversations. So the board had those and approved hire for Portland for Everyone organizer, Madeline Kovacs, who is absolutely phenomenal. And she really stood up the Portland for Everyone coalition with strong grounding for problem statement, right? Housing affordability and availability is the goal here. We have a shortage here in Portland, and that is a contributing factor to the health and well-being of residents here in the city. And then tied that, right, to mission statements and bottom lines for businesses here in Portland, and added a lot of members to the coalition. It did not cost to join the coalition. And again, that goes back to the generosity of our donors making the contributions. And eventually, a lot of businesses and nonprofits seeing the value in being part of the coalition. So affordable housing developers signed on, for-profit developers who would see ability to build duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes signed on. Business for a Better Portland signed on. The home builders signed on, right? They want to build, right, all the products they can. So there's a really nice nexus there. And they dedicated staff time and lobby time. Ezra Hammer, who's on a panel, was just an amazing thought partner in the work. And then in order to get our environmental community, which is so strong, right? Bob Salinger, if you ever had the chance to meet him, at Audubon Society. In City Hall, he's known as if he presses the button, right, if you mess with the tree code, 12,000 people are going to email City Hall in a day, right? So you need your environmental community here behind your policy in Portland. It's why it's so beautiful here, that people power. So we got them, Madeline really got them on board through negotiation of types of considerations where this duplex, triplex, fourplex would be allowed. So at first it was a citywide overlay, and then what are the considerations that are going to bring on Urban Spaces Green Institute or Audubon Society on board. So if we say, well, the land that is critical habitat or environmentally sensitive, that is out of the overlay, then that starts to bring them to the table and say, great, we can support this policy. So that is some of the negotiation on the policy creation happened in order to get that broad and diverse coalition and knowing who's really going to move the policy across the finish line. So I do have to say Meyer Memorial Trust was an amazing partner in this. Land use is so hard to fundraise around in foundations. And so I just, it does sparkle if y'all are in philanthropy or if you're watching on live stream. It does shape, impacts for generations. So I always like to make a plug for don't discount land use as a powerful tool. But Meyer Memorial Trust really took a leap on Portland for Everyone. And I just want to thank them always on that. So that was a little bit nuts and bolts on coalition for Portland for Everyone.
So I'll start with sharing the rationale for how and why we built our coalition. So I know that compared to many of you representing cities in this room, Charlotte is still a relatively affordable place. But over time, Charlotte has become very unaffordable for people who live there or moving from places where the cost of living is lower. Just as some perspective, I moved there from Austin in 2012. My first apartment was $499 a month, walking distance to a light rail, 650 square feet. And it was a relatively decent apartment. My rent started going up by about $50 a year. So in 2016, I bought my house for $65,000, 3 miles from downtown on a high frequency bus route. There's nothing selling in my neighborhood now for under about $220, $230. So Charlotte has seen a very dramatic increase in cost of living and specifically in housing prices. And so one of the things we knew we had to do was really be able to explain to our elected officials that not only do we have a crisis of affordable housing for very low income people, which they've known about for a long time, and we've made some progress on that, but we also have an accelerating crisis of housing for people of low to moderate incomes. And so we really thought about who are the right participants in our coalition. We knew it had to be both a grassroots as well as a grass top effort. Charlotte is definitely a city where it has a certain way of making things happen, and by having an interdependent relationship with government, not independent, not dependent, we knew that we could be most effective based on some of our past strategies. So I definitely want to give a lot of credit to our United Way, which provided a lot of structural and staff support for getting this coalition off the ground. The major role that my organization, Sustain Charlotte, played is really providing technical assistance about how to advocate at both that grassroots and grass tops level. So we started to meet, I think, in early 2021. And some of the partners that we brought into the coalition were Goodwill, and they're very focused on job opportunities and the recognition that not everybody can get to a job with a car. So getting the land use and transportation piece right. DreamKey Partners is an affordable housing developer that partners with the city of Charlotte. The Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy does a lot of work on tenants' rights, as well as making sure that residents, especially in rapidly gentrifying communities, do not fall prey to predatory home buyers. It's a huge problem. The Leading on Opportunity organization, which was formed in response to our 50th out of the 50 largest U.S. cities for upward economic mobility of children born into poverty. And Habitat for Humanity was a really valuable partner as well. We also found that many of the neighborhood leaders in the predominantly Black and brown communities in Northwest and East Charlotte that were working with Habitat for Humanity recognize that we have pretty large lot sizes in Charlotte. Quarter acre to about 4/10 of an acre is not at all uncommon within a few miles of the center of the city. We have a very small, compact downtown area. And so when elected officials started to hear directly from Habitat and other developers of affordable to workforce housing that their main limitation is the cost of land, wouldn't it be great if we could build 2 or 3 homes on a single family lot? This can really help to address our housing crisis, as well as the economic argument was very powerful as well. Charlotte is a rapidly growing region. It's a major financial center, but it also needs to diversify its business, both in terms of size of business as well as sector. So if we want to be competitive and attract talent to our area, as well as provide economic opportunities for people who are born in Charlotte, we really need to make sure that we're providing diverse and affordable housing choices. So our coalition met exclusively online for the first few months, and most of us met for the first time in person when we held a large public event in June. It was outdoors, so it was that time when the pandemic was easing up and we were able to socially distance. And we invited all of our partners to speak, so I think about 7 of them spoke. We also invited every city council member who wanted to speak in support of the comprehensive plan to do so. So 5 of them took us up on the offer, including one who we learned was undecided and wasn't sure about his vote until he spoke at that event and heard from the coalition partners. So that public event was very important to not only really rallying our elected officials, but also demonstrating to the public and to our coalition partners that there are so many reasons that good land use planning and providing for the ability, frankly, to build diverse housing choices and to increase density within our neighborhoods is a win for everyone. So that strategy was definitely very beneficial.
Mm-hmm. And I think in New York, we at least like our major rezoning victory, it was not a part of a plan rewrite or a code review process. So we had to. New York City, somewhat infamously, does not have a comprehensive plan. So we did opt to take advantage of a pre-existing push. In New York City, there are no, well, we had to essentially make use of because Soho, it was previously zoned for only manufacturing. There, as a shopping district, you could not open a store in a vacant building. It would have to go through and get a special permit for a store. So it's like one of these things that it would have to get a vote by the city council. It took a lot of planning time. And so the city has wanted for a long time to rezone at least to legalize retail. And, we had been looking for a place to propose a neighborhood rezoning in terms of, we had thought like maybe Greenwich Village, maybe, Park Slope, these very wealthy neighborhoods that have not seen any growth. But then, we saw this, rezoning, rezoning being proposed in Soho that looked to just legalize retail. And it provided a very easy point for us to say, this should have a significant housing element. And so what we did is we put together a plan that, would propose a large amount of housing growth. It would propose a large amount of mixed income housing. And it would be quite obviously, by being in Soho, in two of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Manhattan, in the country, by an extremely transit-rich area, have access to the best public schools in New York City. So the plan, in some sense, spoke for itself, but we needed to write it. And then the coalition work came in much more in terms of like getting the mayor to take it seriously. So we organized 21 different groups to join us in a letter which we published demanding that the mayor take action. Those groups included, Planning Association in terms of the RPA, the Regional Plan Association of sort of the New York metropolitan area. It included fair housing groups. It included Churches United for Fair Housing, which is a local anti-displacement group. It included local affordable housing groups like small organizations like Cooper Square Committee. But these 21 groups joined us to demand the rezoning go forward, which enabled the mayor to then move forward on it as well, or rather bullied the mayor into taking action. So then we had to support it through the formal approvals process, but that's how we took it from this, a Medium post that we published on, in early 2019 and shepherded it through to pass in December of this past year. So I think that the coalition work and strategy is different from a rewrite, but I think it's worthwhile just in the sense that it's a different avenue that activists potentially can pursue for change. So we have questions for each other, but maybe we should move to questions from the audience. I feel like, yeah.
So we're a pretty wonky organization, but we don't, how do you get city council to do something? Because eventually you want it to be a vote that happens at the city council. Like you talked about, writing a letter to the mayor and then following that up through the approval process. Like, what other things are you doing to, influence city council members and get their votes and get their attention? Like, what are the concrete things we need to do once we have the idea of what should be done?
Yes. I would say that the number one most important thing, I think, is just showing up. We showed up at every single hearing that was tangentially related to the Soho rezoning, and had at least 5 people screaming about how they wanted housing there. But we also spoke to the press at I think it was we made the benefit of also pursuing housing in such a wealthy area, in such an infamously wealthy area, was that it was a great story. And I think using that, was very persuasive to journalists. And I think I think the coalition work is what put it onto the, made it so we were able to bully the mayor. But I don't know, would you, any of you have anything to add in terms of the more?
So in Charlotte, we have a weak mayor system with 2-year terms, so everybody's constantly in campaign mode. It's been very important to work with city staff who tend to stay in their positions longer, as well as to do some power mapping of our city council members. We have 7 council districts, 4 at-large members, and if the council members hear from their constituents in their district, they really do listen because they are always in campaign mode. One strategy that we found was really helpful was to do a photo tour in a predominantly white, wealthy neighborhood that actually had a lot of duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes that really fit in well in the neighborhood. And those were built before zoning made them illegal in other parts of the city. So we were really able to address that we can't change the neighborhood character argument by pointing out that these are already in neighborhoods throughout wealthier, predominantly white parts of Charlotte. They blend in really well. This is not something scary to be afraid of. And that, I think, really helped some of the council members to understand that this is an equity issue.
Maybe I'll just mention, I think one thing, getting back to this city staff idea in Sacramento, I think having a direct line of communication with the actual people who are going to be proposing and speaking in front of council and who actually have a really good handle of the full timeline. These processes take a lot of time, and there's a lot of interim steps and milestones along the way. And if you have a good understanding of when those milestones are, you can actually prepare responses and sort of like your actual advocacy around those timelines and actually be the first one to kind of respond. And in the age of COVID, right, having the first e-comment actually makes a difference, right? It can kind of sometimes drive the conversation and kind of steer it from there. So again, making sure you have a direct line of communication with the city planning staff is huge.
Can one of the panelists restate the question into the mic?
Mm-hmm. Annie?
Hi, I've got a question about kind of piggybacking off of that. What have you all seen as sort of the strategic balance between inserting your organization's views into processes that are already going to happen? So like the routine general plan updates or the budget, all of those types of things that will happen whether you're involved or not, versus proactively initiating a new project from scratch. Obviously, they both kind of have their pros and cons, particularly around the ease of inserting yourself and the other players in there, but I'd love to hear your perspective on kind of successes, failures, and also strategically when you would go or recommend one option over the other.
Yeah, so to repeat the question, it is, what is the difference between inserting yourself into sort of a pre-existing process versus creating your own plan? I guess I can say, I think we did create our own plan, but we were able to insert itself into an existing process. So I think even having some sort of toehold, I think, is very useful. But I also think like you can create your own plan and shout about it. I don't think that's necessarily a bad move, but I think just in terms of opening a door and having at least some sort of process to latch onto is very helpful.
I would say when we heard about the comprehensive plan, well, actually, to take a step back, originally Charlotte was only going to do a unified development ordinance. And then when our planning director, Taiwo Jayoba, was hired, he really pulled us a step back. I say us, this the entire city, and said, before we start creating the regulations, we need to have a vision of what it is that we want to grow into as a city. So that was a really important opportunity to be a part of creating that vision. And because it was not just a land use plan, it is a plan for growth, which also includes mobility and other characteristics beyond housing and transportation. It was so broad that it was a wide open opportunity to insert, additional features that or characteristics that we think are important. So, for example, we are still advocating for an ambitious mode share goal in the strategic mobility plan, which is going to be a supporting document to the Unified Development Ordinance. So we need more housing, but we also need to make sure that people aren't cost burdened by the combined cost of housing and transportation, that they have choices for how to get around. We also recognize that a lot of the neighborhood leaders in the predominantly Black and brown communities in Northwest and East Charlotte have concerns about gentrification and ensuing concurrent displacement. And they are asking for community benefits language to be included, possibly through some type of overlay in areas that have been identified as likely or already experiencing high rates of displacement. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities in a planning process that is so wide-ranging as a comprehensive plan to really figure out how to bring our needs into that.
I think it's a really good question, and it probably depends on where you are. I think in Sacramento, unequivocally, it has been a huge, for all the reasons that have been mentioned, but a politically savvy strategy to have it bundled with everything else that I mentioned in the general plan. Just because I think if it was on an island, it would draw a lot more NIMBY attention, and I think it's just hard, right, for traditional YIMBYs to actually, oppose road diets, electric buildings, parking reform, zoning reform all at the same time. And so just purely from the political perspective, I think there's an advantage to having it bundled into a sort of a larger policy reform agenda.
I'm a big fan of following the budget and diving into it because cities and counties and regional governments have the mandates and they have the shalls that they need to get done. And a lot of it, unfortunately, is unfunded. And so I would say there's the general business, but if you're, I would say how much staff time is dedicated to the shalls? Are they meeting the deadline? And then these the wish list, right? The concept for being creative, right? What are the new ideas that the city council can roll out? Who can take that on? Is an elected office really good at convening people? Do they have that high level of trust? Jackie Dingfelder, who was the housing point for Charlie Hales, the former mayor, actually kickstarted a work group focused on, the problem statement, housing affordability, availability, and size of the houses. We were seeing a lot of big home demolitions and then big homes kind of in the ashes of those homes. And so as an advocacy organization, I think you start to build some political capital when you start to kind of work shoulder to shoulder with some of the bureau directors, your planning director, you're elected to say, hey, your regional government has a competitive grant program, or US EPA or HUD has a grant program. Could we write you a letter of recommendation for staff time to this? So that actually has built some I think goodwill, some political capital, and enabled the bureau to take on projects that are more, I think, creative concept formation.
And I would just add that really making sure that there's a good planning process that truly engages the public is critical, because then you can use that plan to hold the city accountable for its budgeting, for its future policy and regulations. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing, I think, that erodes public trust. Well, maybe very few things that would erode public trust faster than when their input is asked for to develop a plan that may be a great plan, and then it gets literally put in a binder on a shelf. And when our planning director started, he told us that his office had lots of binders, and there's a lot of work that has been done in the past that just does not actually inform decisions that are being made today. So I would say that don't be afraid to advocate for policies that are not included in your municipality's planning process. That's often necessary, but definitely take advantage of the processes that are underway or that could potentially get underway.
I kind of have a two-part, how do you know when to do behind-the-scenes advocacy and when to step forward more in the public space? So working with staff, is one thing, and elected officials having conversations, but when is the opportune time to kind of take that more publicly with op-eds and testimonies? And then in that same vein, I've heard a lot of people say focus on who's with you in this movement, but what about the elected officials who are just straight up no, it's not. I'd like to hear that piece.
So to repeat the question, it is, when is it appropriate to make things public? And the second half of the question, would one of you?
I guess the second half was about when, which political figures to target, and is it worth the time to go after someone in opposition or strong opposition?
From our perspective, so we passed the comprehensive plan 6-5. We would have loved for it to be unanimous. Of the 5 that voted against, I hope I'm remembering this right, 2 were our 2 Republican council members, presumably don't like the additional regulations. 1 was a Democratic council member who was concerned that allowing duplexes and triplexes in East and Far East Charlotte, which does not have much transportation infrastructure other than for single occupancy vehicles, will create more congestion. We tried to share some evidence, but ultimately didn't win that argument. And then 2 council members in predominantly Black communities in West and Northeast Charlotte that are concerned about gentrification. So it was interesting that there were different reasons that council members voted against the comprehensive plan, and I think some of those issues can be addressed by our coalition through research, through stories, and some of the opponents of it were just ideologically opposed to a comprehensive plan and a unified development ordinance. So I still want to win over the council members that care about the lack of transportation infrastructure, that care about gentrification and displacement. Those are legitimate concerns, and they are trying their best to represent their constituents. So I would say that really focus on your elected officials that are really working in good faith to represent the needs of their constituents. There's some that we're probably just never going to win over. So who's in that movable middle? And that's where the power mapping is so important.
I would say the after important decisions, making sure that your coalition is framing how that vote happened. So, for example, the Planning Commission's vote on residential infill project was pretty contentious. And so it was important right after that for the coalition to do some op-eds, to send out some emails to the elected offices, and say this is really healthy debate. And the stated concern was really about displacement from the residential infill project, and showing that actually the policy is reducing the amount of displacement if we don't do anything. And so it was that framing and that making sure that we weren't losing kind of the elected officials or the staff in the mix on that. I would also say kind of more behind the scenes, but really important, Planning Commission appointments and hires. Personnel is policy, and your appointments for the staff, right? If the mayor hires someone that is going to be in opposition or is actually just focused on something else, like garbage and recycling, you're like, maybe the mayor isn't going to prioritize housing reform this year. So a lot of times those are really through just informal, trusted circles. So I would say try to influence those as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, Meg, I think you said it better than I could around just focusing on the city council members that are on the fence. And every group has limited resources, limited time, and it's just your time is gonna be better spent if you're focusing on the people that are either on the fence or convincible, and are acting in good faith. And so we've basically spent zero time on the one or two council members that we know we're never going to get to a yes. And on the other side, we actually are lucky enough to know two are very much on board. So we've spent zero time with them as well, and we've really focused on 4 or 5 in the middle.
I will just add, like a quote, because it's like drilled and ingrained in my brain, is the day the city shut down, we had scheduled a work session on the residential info project. This was when I was working in the mayor's office. And the commissioner who opposed it, incredibly smart planning commissioner background, but just did not like the concept and was on record saying hated skinny homes, like hated the look of them. And she also was a nurse. And so COVID was flaring up. Everyone was trying to figure out what to do. And she used COVID as the way, right? She was like, you need to cancel this work session and stay the project until we can come back in person. And so we were having a little bit of a conundrum because we knew that, now more than ever, we actually needed to make sure that we kept the housing availability going. We didn't want this, we didn't want to contribute to the construction bust that was going to happen. And so we turned to another proposal called Expanding Opportunities for Affordable Housing. That policy was propped up by a coalition of faith-based leaders. And so it's and they wanted to partner with affordable housing on their land to repurpose parking lots, rezone their land so they can build affordable housing on church-owned land. And we were like, this policy isn't controversial. And more likely than not, a politician is not going to go against a bunch of faith-based leaders. So we used that one first during COVID, all virtual, still a lot of community engagement, public testimony, got the MAP app up and running. And then once we did that, right, no opposition there, then we were able to glide through with residential info project and 2 other changes to the zoning code that complemented it. So it's a little bit of a sequence there. You got to choose.
Yeah. If your municipality is early in this process, I will just warn you of a tactic that you're likely to see from opponents. It is we haven't heard from enough people tactic. Because Charlotte was working on this during COVID as well. And the argument goes something like this. This is a comprehensive plan that's going to completely change the built environment in Charlotte. We need to make sure that everybody hears the message and has an opportunity to respond. The city was excellent, and I can say this as someone that has concerns about the way the city does some things, but they did everything possible to engage the public. Online meetings, postcards. They created 2 board games, including one that you could have mailed to your house for free and play with your friends. Online board game sessions, in-person office hours at every local library branch, pop-ups at events. So very, very comprehensive public engagement strategy. That is critical that your city gets that right, that your planning staff get that right, because if they don't do that right, that is one of the major tactics that opponents will use to question the validity of the entire process and set it back.
Questions?
I just wanted to glean as much as I could from all of you on the public perception techniques. So Meg, I heard you talk about tours of certain areas to see housing, and I think Dov, you mentioned renderings of what it would look like to reassure people. I always think of my mom who just looks at these things, it's just developers getting rich and screwing everything up. So I'm just curious about what other techniques can you share that you use with the more general public?
I would say we framed, I think showing what's currently there and is a very valuable technique in that way. Like even in Manhattan and in Soho, we were able to frame our plan as actually like a contextual upzone, which would, just meet densities that were currently allowed in the neighborhood. I think showing what already exists and reassuring people that it's going to be similar to what already exists, that this isn't reinventing the wheel, is a very valuable strategy there. But I think in terms of also like activating, I think pursuing rezonings in wealthier areas also can, activate like people's like natural, progressivity. If you're trying to convince someone who's on the leftier side. And I think an opportunity argument also helps if there's like a mixed income housing component. I think it's very persuasive.
Yeah, many people misinterpret abolishing single family housing or zoning to imagine that they'll not be allowed to build a single family home. So dispelling that myth is important. Charlotte, as I said, 75% of our residential land is zoned for single family. We found it very helpful to join the Neighbors for More Neighbors in Minneapolis. In the spirit of not reinventing the wheel, we work with them to create a website and become Neighbors for More Neighbors Charlotte. And that is a message that really resonates with people. It is about creating space for more neighbors. Everyone in Charlotte knows that it's a rapidly growing city. And when we ask the simple question of where do we want people to be able to live, what if your child graduating from college wants to move to the community? What if your parent wants to move to the community? Will they be able to afford a home or even find an available home, whether it's rental or home ownership? So we had a very positive campaign, and we really did not shy away from talking about the racial history of the injustice of single family exclusively single family zoning, but at the same time we're able to frame this as we are creating more opportunities for home ownership and high quality rentals for people of all ages, abilities, income levels. Another thing that worked well in Charlotte is there's no minimum or maximum house size. As long as you respect the setbacks and the height restrictions, you can build a single family home that would be as large as you could build a duplex or triplex. So we see a lot of, in the predominantly white wealthy neighborhoods, not surprisingly, beautiful 2,500 square feet homes being torn down to build 5,000 square foot homes out to the setbacks. And so the question then really is, well, what is fair? Does it really matter if we have homes for 2 or 3 families in that space, or if one family takes up that entire amount of space? And then the parking question comes up, but that can be addressed. So that works in Charlotte.
Yeah, we focused on options, and I think a lot of age and accessibility was a big one, and the messenger matters, of course, which is why you need that broad and diverse coalition. There were in the communications conversations, there was a lot of listening, actually. There were a lot of visits to neighborhood associations that were really nervous about the increased density in neighborhoods that don't have sidewalks, that don't have bike lanes. And so a lot of neighborhoods, were like, we've been asking for sidewalks and bike lanes for a decade, and now you're going to put in 4 more houses, and we know it's going to flood in January and February. So I think we actually used that kind of listening tour to inform some of the amendments to the residential infill project. So when developers do build a triplex or fourplex, they put in $50,000, per unit towards a local transportation improvement charge, LTIC here in Portland. So we start to grow the pot of funding for that type of infrastructure. So I would say, actually, a lot of times is yes, there's the talking points, and then there's actually some really good policy changes that come out of it too.
Yeah, I would just reinforce pictures, right? Just show exactly what we're talking about in terms of legalizing it. Show that, like was mentioned, they're very similar to the new build single-family homes that are happening in single-family zones right now. And then asking, somewhat uncomfortable questions about okay, here's a neighborhood that is equally far away from downtown that is currently zoned for multifamily, or 28 units an acre or whatever, and then here's a very similar neighborhood right next to it that happens to be wider, wealthier, that's zoned for single family. Why? What's the policy reason for that? And actually kind of turning that question around on folks about what are the policy reasons for the way zoning looks the way it does today.
Mm-hmm. So I know you've been raising your hand a lot, so I don't know, not to put you on the spot.
Sure, no, that's, I was just curious what this is about little victories, but what the big V victory looks like for you guys. Like, what are the end goals that you guys are kind of imagining that you would like to achieve in your city?
Yeah, so I think the to rephrase the question, it's sort of like what we've been talking about little victories. What's the big V victory that you'd like to see? I would like to see the state pass in New York State. New York State has no statewide framework for any kind of fair housing or any kind of nudges of municipalities, guidelines to allow a baseline amount of housing. So I would like to see that change. I would like to see a TOD bill change. I don't think that's unique. But I would also say that in New York City, there is a zoning code that was adopted in 1961, which is the basis for New York's housing woes. Before 1961, there was a lot more construction. 1961, in the late 1960s, you see the housing drop off. So what I would seriously love to see in New York is a complete rethinking of that zoning code. But I think we will be fighting for that for a few years.
Our victory, I think, will be getting the Unified Development Ordinance passed and then making sure it actually sticks. So during the pandemic, a lot of businesses were saying they can't survive without drive-throughs, so hence the Chick-fil-A rezoning exemption to the TOD requirements. So I think that's going to be common in other places too. We obviously need healthy businesses, but we need an overall healthy built environment for everyone. And it is going to be challenging to go from a situation where there were a lot of rezonings and a lot of resident input to having a higher overall standard of development through the UDO. But it's also meant to be a more fair and transparent process, not only to residents, but also to developers. So we need to make sure that both sides of that agreement are respected.
Yeah, we have in Oregon, we have a statewide shortage of about 150,000 homes. And so that's really, that's the measure for success, right? Our values aren't height and quantity, it's connecting people with safe and stable housing. And doing it in a way that maximizes our existing, residential zones so that we're not pitting our farmland or our scenic vistas against housing. We can have it all. And so I think that's really the vision for 1,000 Friends. That's what, the land use planning program would encourage the cities and counties and metro to help zone and build for.
Yeah, I think the victory will be when the zoning code is adopted. I think, it's one thing for the general plan to say fourplexes everywhere. I think, as we all know, the devil's in the details, and there's a whole suite of code components, height, setbacks, minimum lot coverage, all of these things, if not calibrated correctly, could be the new bottleneck and not the 1 unit per parcel that everyone's focusing on. So I think that's what kind of keeps me up at night, is just worrying about, okay, we're going to get this general plan adopted, and then we're going to kind of lose momentum, get complacent, and then, we're going to have some new bottleneck that's kind of hidden behind the code. So the victory will be adopting a code that actually allows for market feasible fourplexes.
So I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to go for you.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that and ask, when the zoning code is passed, how do you ensure, what are you going to do to measure whether or not it's actually having an effect? And even if fourplexes are allowed, are they being built, whether that's because of something hidden or, some new interpretation of some rules?
Yeah, I think the measure is just how many units where. we have a pretty robust process in California for tracking that through annual progress reports and evaluated through housing element updates. So the policy change is great, but as Sam said, it's all about the actual outcomes. So we're just going to be measuring how many actually get built, and if not many are getting built, we'll try to change the rules to make it work.
Yeah, at least so for Portland, the code change became effective August 1st of 2021, and so these are the latest numbers that I have from Bureau of Development Services, and I got to give a shout out to them. They're amazing, right? We need to make sure they have stable funding so that they can process these applications. So they've received 80 new applications for 3+ units in these areas. And I'll just highlight 8 permits are for a 6-plex, which we know needs to be permanently affordable. So we're seeing the numbers. Obviously we want to see more, but actually conversations like this help us to amplify the signal for this zoning code. The bureaus did really great technical assistance workshops for developers. They went to the Home Builders Association roundtable. They went to Oregon APA. So we just need to make sure that we encourage this type of production in the builders and make sure our affordable housing developers are competitive in the market.
So when this big of an ordinance is being applied citywide, it's difficult to predict exactly how it will play out. The city has made very clear that it is a living document. It can be adjusted if needed, and that should be a rigorous process that is based on data. So I believe they will be collecting data about where duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes are being built or where they're not being built, and how that's affecting our overall housing supply. So it's definitely something we know. We're not across the finish line when we pass the Unified Development Ordinance.
Yeah, I would just say the benefit of having a neighborhood level rezoning is that it's easier to tell as projects are permitted. I will say that I think in terms of actual development, it may take some time before we see results from the rezoning. I think a lot of the landowners did not expect it to actually go through, which is a blessing and a curse in that sense. There's a rezoning that passed very similarly that had been expected to go for 10 years. And that saw permits pulled almost immediately. So, but I do think that we will see those either we will see those permits pulled and we'll be able to use it as an example moving forward, or we will be able to work on what's not working or point out likely the reasons why we didn't see as much housing built as we would have liked to. So I think either way the path is fairly evident. So thank you all for coming and joining us today.